All right, good evening, everyone. This is Sachin Karnik. Today is the 13th of February, 2025. I want to welcome you all to our continuing series on the religious traditions of the world. And we're continuing further from last week's question about suffering. This question is a very relevant one. It is known as the problem of evil. Why evil, suffering, pain, all of this exists if God exists? This is the basic question. So I want to talk about this a bit. I'm going to speak straight for, good half an hour or so and see where it takes us. If you want to say something in between while Sachin is speaking here, no problem. You're welcome to do so. Or you can just wait until 7:30, at which point then we'll open it up for discussion, contemplation, dialogue, etc. A couple of background points to keep in mind. So in Western philosophy, in Western religious traditions, there's something called theodicy. You can see this on the screen here. The Western approach, deeply rooted in Abrahamic traditions, centers around the concept of a personal, omnipotent, omniscient, and all-good God. Let's understand that first sentence clearly. We have been talking for many, many weeks now on the Old Testament, on the Hebrew Bible, about the concept of God and the way that God is conceptualized, the trees we've talked about, to some extent. We're going to get back to that next week, but I wanted to get into this question of theodicy today and then see where you all want to take it next time. So first of all, in all three religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, each of them have the concept of a personal, omnipotent, omniscient, and all-good God. This is the basic concept. This is a monotheistic concept. This concept is there in the Eastern monotheistic traditions also, like in Hindu tradition, there is such a concept also. Now, the problem of evil in this context becomes a direct challenge to God's nature. So meaning what? If God is all good, omniscient, can do everything, why are there so many people suffering, horrific diseases, wars? The list goes on. This is called the problem of evil. It's a direct challenge to God's nature, assuming God exists, right? So theodicy, this is a word that if you're taking notes or if you're keeping track of some of the technical lingo, theodicy is the project of justifying God's actions or inactions in the face of evil. There's a whole bunch of theologians who work on this specific area, and there are thousands of books written on this particular subject also. It is a justification of God's actions despite the fact that there's evil. The central questions are three in nature. How can a perfectly good God allow evil to exist? Very interesting question. Why is that even happening? Is God responsible for evil either directly or indirectly? Is God's power limited, or is our understanding of goodness inadequate? Very important and very difficult questions also. If you make the assumption that God does exist the way it is described in the Genesis chapter, in the Old Testament, etc., and then throughout the whole Bible, then if God is perfectly good, why is he allowing, or why is that being allowing evil to exist? Right? Why is that? How can that be? So there's an ontological question there. God has created everything. God has created human beings. And I'm speaking specifically from the Abrahamic traditions right now. Okay, so that's the one question. Is God responsible for evil, either directly or indirectly? So God created the tree of knowledge of good and evil, created Adam and Eve, created all the beings, created everything. So directly or indirectly, he's responsible for it all. One could make that argument. Okay, so you can question that. Is God's power limited, or is our understanding of goodness inadequate? That God cannot really do everything. Is that the case? So Western theodicies typically employ the strategies like the free will defense, ascetic argument, discipline, soul-making, illusion, privation, and mystery. So there are 5 major answers to this question. The free will defense states, it argues that evil stems from the... Christina, did you want to say something? Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll just hit mute there. Okay, so the free will defense states that evil stems from the misuse of human free will, a gift from God. So God gives Adam and Eve free will, all human beings free will, and we have misused it, and that's why there's evil, that's why there's problems, etc. But there's arguments against that also. Anyway, aesthetic argument, claiming that evil contributes to a greater harmony or beauty in the universe. That's an interesting one. That even though evil exists, pain, suffering, problems, children born crippled, wars, hatred, violence, etc., but there is a bigger picture that is necessary for an overall harmony or beauty in the universe. Very interesting argument. The third one here is discipline or soul making, positing that suffering builds character and leads to spiritual growth. Like, for example, when you have hurricanes and tornadoes and towns are turned over, people like to go and volunteer and help the destitute, and it builds character. It helps the society in other ways because they're suffering on one side. A lot of good could be done on the other side because of that suffering. So that's why it exists. So that's another answer to this question. Illusion or privation, that evil is unreal or non-existent. Existent, yes. All that simply means is that it doesn't actually exist. We think it does, but there's no such thing as that in reality. So that's another argument employed in theodicy. And then the fifth major response is that this is a mystery, that this is ultimately unanswerable, that there's no answer to this problem, that if you assume that God exists, then there's no answer. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit here, my own thoughts and commentary on some of this, and see what you all think about it, and we kind of go from there. If we assume, and it's an assumption based on faith or based on acceptance of Scripture, based on acceptance of what Moses taught, or whatever is in the Bible, let's say we're talking about that right now, let's just stick to that. If we accept that there is an all-knowing, all-compassionate, all-seeing, all-doing, the ultimate creator of everything, if you accept that idea of a monotheistic being, then one of these five or more, one or more of those five answers may be logically satisfying. Maybe. You might say that this is just a mystery beyond our understanding, but nonetheless, in some of my commentary on this, we are experiencing good and evil. That much is in our experience. This is in my experience. I'm assuming it's in your experience. Okay? Well, what is the source of that experience? We'll go back to the forbidden fruit analogy, or whatever that was. That there's a fruit that was forbidden, and that's where the good and the bad, the evil and the good, all the duality, the polarity, all those things are born after eating that forbidden fruit. Before that, there was no experience of the knowledge of the good and evil. There's just communion with the transcendent God, something which is indescribable. And then there's that access point, or that forbidden tree. You can assume that God creates that also. And if you assume that, if God has created that also, then why? This is the question in monotheistic religions. If God created everything, why did he create the forbidden tree? Why did he make it forbidden? You see? So the answers that are given, we talked about some of that before, about disobedience and things like that. But then if God is all-knowing, he knows that there's going to be disobedience. He knows that there's going to be this kind of an action. Now, is the whole thing just allegorical? Let's look at some of the other perspectives. Is the entire story in Genesis like a child's story? Some people believe that way. This is just a child's story. That's all it is. It is aimed to describe something that is so beyond, something that cannot be imagined or thought about. And Moses wrote it down in a way that people can understand it. Even little children can understand it. It's a very childish story. It doesn't have any depth actually to it. This is one perspective. I'm not saying that's my perspective. I'm just saying that is a perspective necessarily. That is one of the perspectives. Another perspective in this is that it is putting in allegorical format transcendental phenomena that cannot be described. So the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life, and all those, the cherubim and all those other things that are described in the parts that we've read so far in Genesis, that they are describing something quite transcendental, mystical, but that has to be described at the level of human intellect, and that's why it is described that way as an allegory. And if you remember, if you're keeping notes, there are 5 dimensions or 5 ways to understand all of these scriptures of the world, whether it's the Puranas of India or whether it's the Bible, the 66 books of the Bible, or whether it's the stories in the Quran or any of those things. You can look at them in 5 ways, right? So that is historical, didactic, meaning lesson teaching, metaphysical, metaphorical, and experiential. These 5 dimensions are there. This I've extracted over many years of study of all of this, that this is a way to perhaps wrap our heads around these stories. But nonetheless, in today's world, as has been for thousands of years, there are millions of people now as well as in the past who believe in a monotheistic, all-knowing, all-compassionate, all-good God. Right? This is the basic idea, even in Christianity, Judaism, etc. That is there. Well, all right. So the atheists would argue, and this is not my argument necessarily, I'm just sharing with you different perspectives, that the atheists would argue that there's really no good answer to the problem of evil. They would say that, no, there's no answer. In fact, what they would say, and what they do say, is that the human mind, human tradition, or individuals who are in certain power positions, they have created the concept of God to control millions of people's minds. This is a common argument from atheism. All right. So is that what really happened? Is that what is meant by all of this? Or is there really something transcendental, something extraordinary that was revealed to Moses and to all the prophets, and then, of course, Jesus himself and all of that? So as I said before, there are thousands of perspectives, right? You have to see your own perspective on this, but it just depends on what basis we go. If you create a base of faith that there is God, that God is one and God is whole and God is compassionate, the problem of evil and suffering is an intractable one. It's a very difficult problem. And theodicy is the specific area that actually looks at this. Okay, now having said that, let's go a little bit further into this. Now let's look at some of these ideas from the Eastern tradition. So in India, the concept of liberation or moksha is also there. So Indian traditions, while acknowledging diverse range of deities and philosophical viewpoints, tends to frame the problem of suffering differently. The central concern is not justifying a creator God, but understanding the nature of suffering and finding a way to escape it. So this is a different type of emphasis. If you look at this statement here, I'll make that in bold for you so you can take a look at that. The central concern is not justifying a creator God, because theodicy justifies it. The apologetics is a whole area in all religions, really, but specifically in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that there is a lot of analysis and justification for the doctrines that have been laid out. So that's called apologetics. So the central concern in Eastern traditions is not justifying a creator God, but understanding the nature of suffering. What is suffering? Why does it happen? What is the cause of that? Then you go into the mental space and things like that. Finding a way to escape it. How to get out of it. There's just 4 points here that are common to many Eastern traditions. Sansara, it's a word there. Cycle of birth, death, rebirth, driven by karma. Now this is interesting. We talked about karma a little bit before. Let's talk about this a bit here. Who is it, or what is it that is trapped in the cycle of birth and death? So the notion in Hinduism, Jainism, and Sikhism is that there is a divine spark, a soul, an actual soul beyond the mind that is caught inside this cycle of birth and death. And the concept is that the substance of that soul is not a physical substance, nor is the soul a physical substance. It is the same as infinite consciousness. So that infinite consciousness, you could translate that as God, but that's not really the right translation. Because God, when we use that word, it refers to a personal deity. But when we say infinite, impersonal consciousness, it's not a personal deity. It is a type of just unending reality that just exists everywhere. And we're going to talk about this when we have the retreat at my house, because the retreat is specifically on this subject in more detail. But it's beyond the boundary of angel wings, so we're going to talk about that. Spend a half day or even more if you want. You can welcome to stay as long as you want. We can go deep into this question. But for our purposes right now, in the comparative sense, what is it that is caught in the cycle of birth and death? Question number 1. How was the cycle of birth and death discovered? Question number 2. Why is it that the Judeo-Christian tradition and the Islam tradition does not accept the cycle of birth and death. A lot of questions. Again, we would need many, many, many hours and days to probe this further. But in simple nuggets, I try to put it to you this way. The cycle of birth and death, cycle of reincarnation, is also called metapsychosis. If you don't know that, you may never heard that word before. Metapsychosis means that one is, basically dreaming up this world. We're trapped inside our own constructs, lifetime to lifetime to lifetime. This is technically called metapsychosis. A person who is psychotic, who has a psychiatric disorder, is hallucinating and has tactile and visual and olfactory hallucinations and stuff like that. So what they say is that it's something like this. It's not really like a hallucination that way. It's much greater than that. That the entire material existence is being dreamed up by consciousness manifesting as the individual and is dreaming it up and is stuck inside its own ignorance. So this is one answer from the non-dualistic point of view. There's another answer which is even more intricate, but I don't want to go into that right now. My only point is that where did this come from, the cycle of birth and death? Is it just something that some people dreamt up one day? As far as my objective study on this goes, thousands and thousands of years of meditation in Eastern traditions, which is based on meditation and going into the nature and Himalayas and caves and going into yogic states, that this was a discovery. That in the depths of meditation, it was discovered that there is this individualized soul or consciousness that is traveling from birth to birth, species to species. And in scriptures like the Bhagavatam in India, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavatam, that is not the Bhagavad Gita. It is called Bhagavatam, Srimad Bhagavatam, which some of you may not know about that. It's 18,000 verses. It is the 18th Purana. And we're going to talk about this in a lot of detail, probably like 2 years from now, probably. We'll get to Hinduism 2 years from now. But I'm just mentioning some points here. That is an 18,000 verse scripture, which most people in Judeo-Christian tradition don't know anything about that. Many Hindus have heard the word, they have never studied it. Only few organizations really have studied in detail. And it is an extraordinary scripture, like so many, but it's the 18th massive Purana. It's called Purana, not Quran, but Puran. And these are stories of the gods, essentially. So those stories, or whatever they are, but they are stories of the different Hindu deities, what we consider to be the Hindu deities. These stories are in these 18 Puranas. And the 18th Purana describes in there this 8.4 million species that have been discovered by the ancient sages. And the soul revolves in those 8.4 million species. This is called the cycle of reincarnation. You see, so the cause of suffering from this Eastern point of view, from this more this notion that the soul is trapped in this cycle, it comes from the discovery of this cycle, and it also comes from the notion that one can be released from this cycle and reach that dimension of reality, that supreme reality that is beyond this cycle of rebirth. And that is infinite consciousness. That is unending, infinite consciousness or reality or truth or bliss. This is how it is described. And once you come out of the cycle, then you are one with the infinite, and then it cannot be described. There's no way to describe even what that is. So this is the basic theory, at least, is the basic concept in the Eastern side. So what is the cause of the pain and suffering and problem of evil? Theodicy, in terms of, it's not about some God sitting in some heaven, although those concepts are there too, but it's not in the more non-dualistic sense. It's about consciousness that itself is dreaming itself as the many. This is the basic idea. And we're going to talk about this and compare this with many other ideas later on. But this is the idea. Now, this idea is starkly different from a monotheistic notion. Now, the people who subscribe to the non-dualistic concept that there's one dreaming the many, what they would say is that even scriptures like the Puranas in India, any dualistic worship, the gods and all the different deities, and or the God of the Jews or Jesus. Jesus is a human manifestation. But all of these stories and any kind of dualistic worship, the people who are deep into non-dualism would say, and they do say, this is just kindergarten level religion. It's just you're just beginning the path of spirituality. They don't discount it. They say you're just in the very KG level, first grade. The PhD is non-dualism. This is only elementary school level stuff only. That's what they would say. And they do say, and if you actually study non-dualism in detail, you might come up with that conclusion. I'm not saying that's what it is. It's up to each person, because these are starkly different perspectives. Many people have this notion everything leads to the same thing, which is absolutely not true. They say all the religions lead to the same goal. That's absolutely not true. They are 99% different from each other, and they are so different that if you go into the depth of each of them, they have tight theological boundaries. Like people on the non-dual side, they actually do not accept, even at the highest level, any kind of a dualistic God. If you really go into that, the people don't have no knowledge of this, they haven't studied it. If you go into Christianity, the concept is salvation is through Christ only. Nobody else gets salvation. Some people believe that way. Some Christians don't believe that, but there's divisions among them also. So, and then if you go to Judaism, they don't accept Jesus. They don't accept so many other things. So every religion has its own core belief system, has its own theology, its own perspective that starkly differs from others. They don't all synchronize together and lead to the same place. This is a totally wrong idea. If you study them, you'll find that's not the case. Now, people have tried to do that. They say that let's find a way to just blend them all together. Some sages in India, the Indian tradition has this kind of openness that tries to find all the interconnections and tries to synchronize. It's called synchronicity. It's called syncretism or something like that. There's a word for that, to try to mesh them all together. You can create a new religion that way, mesh them together and create something new. That's a possibility. So that would be a perspective in itself, that there are those who have tried to practice various traditions and said, no, the ultimate truth, they came upon the truth maybe through those different paths. We don't know, right? But in terms of the doctrines themselves, there are a lot of differences. Even Buddhism, you take what we call Buddhism in terms of, it doesn't believe in soul. It does accept reincarnation. So they say the mind reincarnates, not the soul. That there's nothing like soul. There's only mind. And there's hundreds of thousands of pages of analysis on this concept. So many forms of Buddhism. You could spend lifetimes, studying just that one theory. This is why the subject is very, very tricky. This is no small task. And see, the general public is just worried about their daily life. They don't know all these things. General public doesn't even care about all these things. They're following something or other. They're trying to survive. They're trying to gain sensory pleasures of the world, and that's the end of it for most people. Eat, drink, and be merry, and leave all these things aside. But there's a small percentage of individuals who really have studied this. And then the masses are just following based on some tradition, some culture, something. They have not taken time to study any of these traditions in detail. You see, so even if you study any one of them, there is a phenomenal amount of depth. So something like Theodicy, the question of evil and suffering, if you really question this thing and look at the literature that's available, so many sages and mystics and so many theologians like St. Augustine, they have written thousands of pages on these. And if you go into it, it is centered around certain fundamental beliefs that God exists, that God is one, that God is the creator. These are the basic beliefs. And it is on the basis of those beliefs that the entire theology is developed and the analysis is developed. If you go into something like non-dualism, you think of it as a belief in one sense, but it's not really that it's a discovery that everything is one. Like pantheism or non-dualism or monism, it's called. All right, how do you know that? Is that the experience that we have? We have experience of plurality. Then what is the one? Is there a one behind the plurality? It sounds nice. The doctrine of oneness sounds very good. But is that really the truth? Or is there some, or is the truth that there is a dualistic framework of reality, that there is this, this plural world, and there is a supreme reality beyond this, and they both exist. So that is a dualistic framework. But pure non-dualism says that there is nothing other than the one. That's pure non-dualism, total non-dualism. You see, so these perspectives, they are definitely distinct and different. There's no doubt about that. But nonetheless, if you examine them even at a much greater level, it is possible to find that there is a thread that runs through them all. And you know what that thread is? It's very interesting. Now, this is just only my own perspective, Sachin's perspective on this one. The thread is the human mind that runs through them all. We cannot deny the existence of the human mind. Our human mind is involved in all of these traditions. Even if to read a scripture, to write a scripture, to write something down, like for example, the yogic tradition, Patanjali, a master who wrote down 200 aphorisms, right? But why did he wrote them down in Sanskrit? Oh, these are the yogic aphorisms. Where did he get that from? So he synthesized yoga from that came before him. He was a master himself. He wrote them down as a path for people to follow. The human mind is involved in that. Moses writing down the Torah, mind is involved in that. Us reading the scriptures, mind is involved. That is the common thread that runs everywhere. Mind is involved in this. If mind is not there, there is no knowledge of it. Or even we are not there. If we lose our mind, what do we have? We don't have anything. So mind is involved in everything. Even if you're atheistic, mind is involved in that proclamation God doesn't exist. Mind is the common thread. And then that, if you consider it from that perspective, that would be the purview of psychology of religion. The area of psychology of religion looks at how mind has created or is involved in the development of religious doctrines, theologies, ideas, etc. Even the big sages from India, very enlightened beings that are considered to be enlightened, they have a mind, they have a body, just like we do. They're using it into writing all kinds of philosophies and ideas and theories and all that. If mind is not there, how you will communicate to somebody? So the one common thread that is running everywhere through all human experience, including the religious experience, religious doctrines, is the human mind, human thought. And that's why we have the TEMDE. In the thought, emotion, memory, desire, energy. These five are common. Their expressions are diverse, but they are universal. They are absolutely existing. And that is the great mystery. Something like problem of evil and suffering, you could debate back and forth. There's no end to the debate, you see. But now let me just take it just very quickly, just take another minute here and just make a couple more points about this. When a person accepts doctrines, let's just take the Judeo-Christian doctrine of a monotheistic God, all loving, all compassionate, all that. And let's just assume for a moment that we cannot understand the mystery and the mind of God, but we believe in Him, have faith in Him, etc. Things like that, and there's deep faith and prayer and all that. So if one says we cannot understand the mysteries, but there is a foundation of faith, foundation of belief, and then the scriptures that are written are used to go further, to delve further, for further depth and further analysis, then what happens, again, this is a possibility. One can evolve in a religious sense or in a spiritual sense or even in a reflective, meditative sense based on that foundation of the acceptance of certain doctrines. Because you cannot build unless there is a foundation. You see, now if you don't accept the foundation at all, like atheists, then there's no question of building anything on that foundation. Because the atheists believe anything you build on these beliefs is just a delusion, like Richard Dawkins, the God delusion. So there's people, they absolutely reject these ideas. So that's a different matter. But if a person accepts this, it's a matter of accepting it and being convinced. That's what apologetics is about, to convince the individuals in society that you should believe, have strong faith in these certain doctrines, Catholic doctrines or Protestant doctrines or Methodist doctrines or Unitarian doctrines or whatever it may be, whichever denominations, Jewish doctrines, whatever, right? Many denominations throughout the world, Hindu doctrines, atheistic doctrines, theistic doctrines. There's always a set of them. And then on that basis, there is a formulation. Even the synchronistic idea that all these religions, they actually are talking about the same thing. And so that's a doctrine in itself. Even if somebody says everything leads to one, that's an idea that's in somebody's mind. Mind is always present. Experience is present to some extent, right? So it is on the basis of doctrines, beliefs, established practices that one can try to progress further. If you just remove that basis completely, the only thing you're left with is nature, the scientific method, your own experience, your own breath and breathing and sense experience, and whatever is known through sense experience. That's all you're left with. That's all we're left with. And then people live that way too. And then there's people who have also tried to open into higher consciousness just through that. They're rejecting all scriptures, all traditions, everything, like J. Krishnamurti. Some of you know about him. Don't worry about the name. It's not about Krishna, the God Krishna. That's just the name of the last name of the individual. He's a South Indian philosopher. He rejected everything, each and everything, just threw everything out the window, and said all these traditions, all the books, he just throw everything out and start fresh, just with awareness. That's nothing else. So there's people. This is why this subject is so tangled up, you see. But I'm trying to present it in simple way, not to create confusion. My humble request in closing, my little commentary here, my most sincere humble request is to be very patient. Not to get overwhelmed, not to be confused. If you are interested in studying these things in more detail, take one question, probe it carefully. Try to be clear about one thing as clearly as possible. That's good enough. I know I'm presenting certain ideas today. My only point was theodicy and the question of problem of evil. That was the only thing. I tried to present it with a little mixture of different connected ideas here, just to give a little broad perspective on that. I'll stop here for now and open it up for all of you to make comments.